The soft morning light filtered through the white silk curtains, gently illuminating my dressing room on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. As I gazed at my reflection in the full-length mirror, I couldn't help but smile at the sight before me. I, Sophie Brown, was about to embark on what should have been the most joyous day of my existence. At least, that's what I told myself it would be. The princess line wedding dress, with its delicate lace details, fit my body perfectly, like it was made just for this moment. I ran my hand over the fabric, pausing briefly at my stomach, where a small secret lay hidden from everyone's eyes. This 3-month secret was shared only with my fiancé, Ryan. My mother's voice suddenly broke through my thoughts, asking if I was ready. When I turned around, I saw tears of joy welling up in her eyes. I managed to keep my composure as I told her I was ready, though inside I felt a whirlwind of emotions. Joy, nervousness, and guilt about keeping our secret were all battling within me, as my mother helped with the final touches. As she worked, my mind drifted back to my conversation with Ryan the night before. Ryan had held my hand and asked if I was sure about not telling everyone about the baby yet. I had nodded with determination, explaining that telling his mother now could ruin the wedding. Ryan had sighed but eventually agreed, though he made me promise to tell everyone soon. He didn't want to start our marriage with such a big secret. Coming back to the present moment, I felt guilt rising in my chest once again. Barbara Jones, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, was well known in high society for her strict, traditional values. I knew the news of her son marrying a woman who was already pregnant would shock her to her core. But I loved Ryan, and he loved me, and I foolishly thought that would be enough to overcome any obstacle. The drive to the church was filled with emotion. My father Mark watched me proudly from the passenger seat, telling me in a voice thick with emotion that even though he was giving me away today, I would always be his little girl. I squeezed his hand tightly, assuring him that I would always be his daughter, no matter what happened. As we arrived at the church, waves of nervousness washed over me. The doors opened, and the wedding march began to play. With each step down the aisle, I could feel my heart beating stronger and faster. Ryan stood at the altar in his black tuxedo, his smile seeming to light up the entire church. But then I noticed the front row, where Barbara sat, her expression unreadable. Her expression mixed pride with something else I couldn't quite understand. Next to her sat Rebecca, my soon-to-be sister-in-law, who kept glancing uneasily between my mother and me. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling and focused on Ryan. When I reached the altar and he took my hand, I felt everything would be all right. His loving blue eyes filled me with a sense of security and peace. Ryan whispered that I looked beautiful, his words meant only for my ears. I felt my cheeks flush as I told him how handsome he looked. The ceremony proceeded like a dream. We exchanged our vows, promising to love and honor each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. When the priest declared us husband and wife, my heart felt ready to burst with joy. Yet as we walked back down the aisle as newlyweds, I again noticed the strange looks between Rebecca and Barbara. I tried to tell myself their expressions were merely from the emotion of the ceremony. In the car heading to the reception, Ryan noticed my worry and gently stroked my cheek, asking what was wrong. I hesitated before mentioning how his mother and sister had seemed to act strangely during the ceremony. Ryan furrowed his brow and assured me they were just moved by the ceremony. I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right. But as we approached the venue, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. What should have been the happiest day of my life was beginning to be overshadowed by anxiety. When we arrived at the venue, we were surrounded by a whirlwind of smiles and congratulations. Friends, family, and acquaintances gathered around us offering their best wishes. Yet I noticed Barbara keeping her distance, her smile seeming forced and her eyes hiding something. My mother's voice broke through my thoughts, asking if I was all right as I looked worried. I forced a smile and told her I was just nervous. But in truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change everything. The reception venue was even more magnificent than I had dreamed. High ceilings, adorned with frescoes, crystal chandeliers hanging with dignity, and polished marble floors reflecting light created a fairy tale atmosphere. Yet despite all the surrounding beauty, I couldn't dispel the anxiety I had felt since the church. Ryan and I moved among the guests, receiving congratulations and words of encouragement. His hand rested on my waist, providing reassurance. But each time I looked at Barbara and Rebecca, I felt that reassurance slipping away. While greeting college friends, I whispered to Ryan, asking if we could talk privately. He looked at me with concern and asked if there was a problem. We excused ourselves from the guests and moved to a quiet corner of the venue. I took a deep breath and began to express my concerns about how strangely his mother and Rebecca had been acting since the ceremony. Ryan frowned as he watched his mother and sister whispering together across the room. He slowly admitted that they did seem a bit unsettled. My heart began to race as a terrible thought occurred to me. I instinctively placed my hand on my stomach, wondering aloud if they somehow knew our secret. Ryan's eyes widened with surprise and worry. He insisted that was impossible since only we knew about it. But as he spoke, his face showed uncertainty as he asked about where I had taken the pregnancy test. I felt my blood run cold. In a whispered voice, I told Ryan that I had left the pregnancy test in the church bathroom, having forgotten to dispose of it in my excitement and nervousness. The color drained from Ryan's face. He couldn't finish his sentence about what if Rebecca had found it, but we both understood the implications. Rebecca had always been a dutiful daughter who would certainly report such a discovery to her mother. Ryan declared with determination that we needed to talk to them before things got out of control. I nodded, feeling my stomach tie itself in knots. As we approached Barbara and Rebecca, I remembered all the disapproval Barbara had shown me from the beginning. In her eyes, I had never been good enough for her son, lacking the wealthy background, proper connections, and refinement she expected in a daughter-in-law. Ryan called out to his mother and sister, asking if we could speak privately. Barbara looked at us with an expression I couldn't quite read, whether it was disappointment, anger, or her usual contempt for me. She agreed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and suggested we go to her private room. We followed Barbara and Rebecca across the venue, feeling the curious stares of the guests. Barbara's private room was impressive, with shelves of old books and a large mahogany desk in the center. After Barbara closed the door behind us, the silence became unbearable. She broke it with an icy voice, suggesting we had something to tell them. I looked to Ryan pleadingly for help. He took my hand and stepped forward, beginning to explain that we had something to tell them, though we had planned to wait until after the wedding. I could feel my eyes filling with tears as Rebecca interrupted angrily, demanding to know if we had planned to deceive everyone at the wedding. I tried to explain that wasn't the case, but Barbara cut through the air with a voice sharp as steel. She told me she didn't want to hear excuses, revealing that Rebecca had found the pregnancy test in the church bathroom. Her words struck me like a physical blow as she demanded to know how I could disgrace their family name. I felt Ryan squeeze my hand reassuringly. He spoke to his mother in a respectful but firm voice, telling her that we were both happy about the pregnancy. He explained that while it had happened before the wedding, it didn't change anything, since we loved each other and wanted to start a family. Barbara let out a bitter laugh at the mention of family. She turned to Ryan, asking if he didn't understand what I had done, accusing me of trapping him and planning the pregnancy from the beginning. I felt the blood drain from my face at her accusations. I pleaded with her, insisting that I loved Ryan and would never do such a thing. Rebecca interjected with contempt in her voice, saying everyone knew how desperate I had been to become part of their family. She accused me of planning to secure my place through pregnancy, all along. As I listened to these incredible accusations, I looked at Ryan, hoping he would defend me and tell them they were wrong. But when I saw doubt clouding his eyes, I felt my world beginning to crumble. I whispered his name, reminding him that he knew I would never do something like this. For a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with as he looked at me. But as soon as he glanced at his mother, doubt clouded his eyes again. He finally released my hand, saying he didn't know what to think. It felt like a punch to my stomach. I asked him what he meant, reminding him that we had been together for years and he knew me. Barbara interrupted with a poisonous voice, mockingly asking if I never lied or deceived. She pointed out that I had already deceived everyone outside, even my own family. Tears were now streaming down my cheeks as I felt trapped and betrayed by the people who were supposed to become my new family. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Rebecca glanced at her watch and suggested we return to the reception, noting that the guests must be wondering where we were. Barbara nodded but turned to me before opening the door. She warned me this wasn't over, stating she wouldn't let me ruin her son's future. They left the room, leaving Ryan and me alone. The silence between us was unbearable. In a final whisper, I begged him not to believe what they had said, reminding him that he knew me and knew I loved him. He stared at me, with a storm of emotions swirling in his eyes. Ryan said he loved me, but questioned why I had wanted to keep silent until the last moment. His words hit me like a slap across the face. I reminded him in disbelief that we had only discovered the pregnancy that very morning when we took the test, and we had agreed together to wait until after the wedding to tell everyone. Looking at the confusion on his face, I realized, with horror, that his mother and sister's words had planted seeds of doubt in his heart. He said he needed time to think and walked toward the door. Left alone in the room, I felt my perfect world crumbling around me. I wondered how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Just hours ago, I had been living in a fairy tale, and now everything had turned into a nightmare. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I knew I had to be strong, for myself and for the baby. I left the private room and returned to the main hall. The guests continued their celebrations, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Ryan was talking with some friends, pretending everything was normal. Barbara and Rebecca were chatting with other society ladies, their perfect smiles hiding the venom they had just spewed. I made my way to my parents, who were watching me with concern. My mother noticed my red eyes and asked if I was all right. I forced a smile and told her I was fine. But I knew nothing was fine. What should have been the happiest day of my life had become the beginning of a nightmare. Worse still, I knew this was only the beginning. Barbara would not let this end here. The question was what I would do. Should I fight for my marriage and family, or yield to the pressure from the Jones family? I looked at Ryan again, hoping to catch his eye and see some sign that everything would be okay. But he avoided my gaze, and I felt another crack form in my heart. As the celebration continued around us, I wondered if we could ever go back to the way things were. The reception was at its peak. Laughter and music filled the air, creating a painful contrast to the storm raging inside me. I, Sophie Brown, newly married and carrying what was no longer such a secret, moved among the guests like an automaton. I smiled and thanked people for their now hollow-sounding congratulations. My eyes constantly searched for Ryan, but he seemed to be deliberately avoiding me. I could see him talking and laughing with guests, but always maintaining a careful distance from me. Whenever our eyes met, he quickly looked away, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. That small gesture hurt more than anything Barbara or Rebecca had said. My mother's gentle voice broke through my thoughts, asking if I was really all right, as she had noticed something was wrong. I forced another smile, though wearing this mask was becoming increasingly heavy with each passing moment. I reassured her that I was just tired, but I could see in her eyes that maternal instinct of hers, knowing something deeper was troubling me. Before she could probe any further, the master of ceremonies' voice echoed through the hall, announcing it was time for the mother of the groom's speech. I felt my heart stop for a moment, knowing Barbara was about to speak. I wondered what she would say, if she would maintain the pretense of happiness and acceptance. I took my place at the main table, with Ryan beside me, though he felt miles away despite our physical proximity. Barbara rose with her usual grace, perfectly poised in her blue silk dress, her hair immaculately styled, wearing that smile that never quite reached her eyes. She began with a clear, strong voice, addressing the dear friends and family, announcing that this was a day of celebration as her beloved son had found the woman to share his life with. She paused, and for a brief moment, I dared to hope she might keep her composure. But then her tone shifted ever so slightly as she continued, saying she had something to tell everyone. I felt Ryan tense beside me, and our eyes met briefly, his filled with fear, though I wasn't sure whether he feared the truth coming out or confronting his mother. Barbara spoke my name like it was a curse, announcing that I had been keeping a secret that would completely change the nature of this marriage. The silence that fell over the room was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me, some curious, some already judgmental. Then Barbara delivered the final blow, her voice dripping with contempt as she announced my pregnancy. She declared that I had deceived her son, their family, and everyone present, calling the wedding a farce based on lies and deception. Her words exploded in the room like a bomb, and whispers spread like wildfire through dry grass. I saw expressions of shock, indignation, and even cruel smirks, but what hurt most were my parents' faces. My mother's eyes filled with tears while my father's face showed a mixture of confusion and disappointment. I stood up on trembling legs. I began to speak, my voice barely audible, pleading with Barbara to understand. I tried to explain that things weren't as she was describing, that Ryan and I had a different story to tell. Before I could finish my sentence, I felt the shocking impact of Barbara's hand striking my cheek, making me stumble. The sound of the slap echoed through the hall, silencing all whispers. Barbara screamed at me to be quiet, her face contorted with rage as she called me a lying woman. She accused me of being a selfish gold digger who had seduced her son to catch a good match. The physical pain in my cheek was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. Tears began streaming down my face, ruining the carefully applied makeup from that morning. My father's voice rose, trembling but firm, demanding to know how she dared to strike his daughter. But Barbara wouldn't stop, turning back to me, with hatred in her eyes unlike anything I had ever seen before. She spat out words calling me a disgusting beggar, declaring she would never accept me as family, never. The silence that followed was unbearably heavy. I looked around desperately seeking support, understanding, anything. All I saw were uncomfortable expressions, averted gazes, and most cruelly, satisfied smirks from those who seemed to be enjoying this spectacle. In the midst of this chaos, I searched for Ryan, my husband who had sworn eternal love to me, just hours ago. He sat there, staring at his china plate as if it held all the answers. I whispered his name, my voice trembling, begging him to say something. But he remained silent, as still as a statue. His silence hurt more than any words could have. In that moment, I realized I was completely alone. The guests began whispering again, and I caught fragments of their conversations. Some said they had never trusted me from the start, others expressed pity for Ryan, while some wondered how I could have deceived everyone like this. Each word felt like a dagger piercing my heart. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find my mother, her eyes wet with tears, but also showing a determination I had never seen before. She gently suggested we should leave, saying I didn't need to stay in a place like this. I looked at Ryan one last time, wondering what I had been hoping for, perhaps that he would stand up and defend me. Would he confront his mother at last? But he remained seated, avoiding my gaze. In that moment, something inside me shattered, yet simultaneously, I felt a new strength emerging. With trembling hands, I removed my wedding ring. I stared at it for a moment, remembering the vows we had exchanged just hours ago, vows that now rang hollow. I spoke to Ryan, my voice surprisingly steady, telling him that someone who couldn't protect me now would never be able to protect our child. I dropped the ring onto the table, the sound of metal hitting china resonating through the renewed silence. I turned to face Barbara, who watched me with a mixture of triumph and contempt in her eyes. I addressed her as Mrs. Jones, my voice remarkably calm, telling her it was unfortunate she could only see things through her prejudice. I promised her that her grandchild would grow up knowing what true, unconditional love meant, something she would never understand. A collective gasp rippled through the room, as no one had expected this beggar woman to dare stand up to the Jones family matriarch. My father approached and wrapped his arm protectively around my shoulders. He spoke with pride in his voice, saying we didn't belong in this world of hypocrisy. Despite the tears still streaming down my face, I held my head high as I began walking toward the exit. The crowd of guests parted before us, some with eyes of pity, others with disgust, and a few with something approaching respect. Just as we reached the door, I heard Ryan's voice calling me to wait. I stopped, my heart pounding fiercely. For a brief moment, a tiny flame of hope flickered in my chest. But when I turned, Ryan stood between the table and us, his face etched with conflict. He apologized, in a barely audible voice, saying he couldn't protect me. He didn't need to finish. I understood he couldn't choose me over his family, his social status, everything he had ever known. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. I said goodbye gently, telling him I hoped someday he would become the man I had believed him to be. With those final words, I left the hall. The cool night air hit my face, washing away the last traces of my former life. Walking to the car between my parents, I felt a surge of emotions rising within me. I felt a mix of pain, sorrow, and fear, but surprisingly also relief and determination. I looked back one last time at the illuminated palace, hearing the muffled sounds of music and conversation. It was the end of a chapter in my life, ending in the most unexpected and painful way. As I got into the car, I placed my hand protectively over my stomach, knowing this was also the beginning of something new. It wouldn't be easy, but I had my family, my baby, and most importantly, I had myself. My father asked gently what I planned to do as he started the car. I watched the city lights blur past the window, and told him simply that I wanted to go home. The journey from the reception hall to home was a stream of streetlights and silence, a silence that screamed louder than any words. My parents in the front seat exchanged worried glances through the rearview mirror, but neither dared to break the quietness that enveloped us. I, Sophie Brown, or should I say Sophie Jones, though that surname now felt bitter in my mouth. I sat in the back seat in my crumpled, tear-stained wedding dress, staring out the window, but seeing nothing. My mind kept replaying the events of the past few hours like a film I couldn't stop. We arrived at our modest but comfortable home on the outskirts of town. My father turned off the engine, and for a while, no one moved. Finally, my mother broke the silence, turning in her seat to look at me, and gently telling me we were home. I nodded mechanically and got out of the car, my feet feeling heavy as if walking through wet sand. Entering the house, each step brought a flood of memories from my childhood and teenage years. The photos on the walls, the old sofa where I spent hours reading, the familiar smell of my mother's cooking, everything seemed to belong to a different life, a different Sophie. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror, barely recognizing the woman reflected there. My elaborate hairstyle had fallen apart, my makeup was streaked with tears, and my eyes looked years older than they had just hours ago. My mother placed her hand on my shoulder, telling me she would prepare a warm bath. I nodded again, unable to form words. I made my way to my old room, the one my parents had kept untouched since I left to live with Ryan. The irony struck me, returning to my single-life bedroom on my wedding day. As I removed my wedding dress, each movement painfully reminded me of how things should have been. Each pearl, piece of lace, and fold of white fabric seemed to mock me. I let the dress fall to the floor, where it pooled like my shattered dreams. The warmth of the bath offered small comfort as I sank into the water, feeling it seep into my tense muscles, wishing it could wash away the pain in my heart. I closed my eyes, but quickly opened them again, for each time I closed them, I saw Ryan's face, silent and still while Barbara humiliated me in front of everyone. That silence, that cursed silence that rang louder than any scream could have. The wedding vows we had exchanged just hours ago now echoed emptily in my memory, Ryan promising to love, honor, and cherish me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for all our lives. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, all our lives had barely lasted a day. After the bath, I put on my old pajamas and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around the room. Photos of Ryan and me decorated the walls and bedside table, frozen moments of happiness. Our first vacation, college graduation, the night he proposed, all captured in those frames. I picked up one photo, running my finger over Ryan's smiling face, whispering, asking him why he hadn't said anything. A gentle knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I answered with a voice hoarse from crying and silence. My parents came in carrying a tray with tea and cookies, sitting on either side of me just as they used to do when I had nightmares as a child. My father began speaking with emotion in his voice, apologizing that he couldn't do anything to help. I cut him off, telling him it wasn't his fault, that no one could have predicted this would happen. My mother took my hands in hers, asking gently if I could tell them what had happened that morning. I took a deep breath, unsure if I wanted to talk, but the words came flooding out anyway. I told them about the pregnancy test that morning, Rebecca finding it, the confrontation in the reception hall anteroom. I spoke about Barbara's cruel words and public humiliation, the sting that still lingered on my cheek from her slap, and finally, Ryan's silence. Through fresh tears rolling down my cheeks, I told them his silence had hurt the most, that if he had just said something, stood up for me, stayed by my side, I might have been able to bear everything else. My mother held me tightly, whispering words of comfort to her dear child through her own tears. I watched as my father paced back and forth across the room, his eyes filled with both anger and helplessness. Through clenched teeth, he called Ryan a coward, saying he couldn't believe how someone they had treated like family could do this to us. My mother gently interrupted him, urging him to calm down. He nodded and returned to sit beside me, apologizing and saying it pained him to see me suffering so much. I nodded back, feeling grateful for their love and protection. We sat in silence for a while, with only the ticking of the wall clock marking time's passage. Finally, my mother spoke up, asking me what I planned to do about the baby, though she added that it might be too early to think about it. Her question caught me off guard. In all the chaos, I had almost forgotten about the tiny life growing inside me. Instinctively, I placed my hand on my stomach. With a firmness in my voice that surprised even me, I told them I would keep the baby. I declared that this was my child, and regardless of what happened with Ryan, I would carry and raise this baby myself. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. My father squeezed my hand and assured me they would walk this path with me. I whispered my thanks, overwhelmed by their unconditional love. The rest of the evening passed quickly in hushed conversations and long silences. Eventually, my parents retired to their room, but not before making sure I had eaten something and finished the tea they had brought me. Left alone in my room, the darkness of night seemed to mirror my dark thoughts. I picked up my phone to find dozens of missed calls and messages, mostly from concerned friends who had witnessed the disaster at the reception. But what caught my eye was a message from Ryan. He wrote that he was sorry and didn't know what to say, asking me to please call him. As I stared at the screen, I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and an aching longing. Some part of me wanted to call him, to hear his voice, to demand explanations. But I knew there were no words that could fix what had happened. I turned off the phone and placed it on my bedside table. The next day would be a new day, and I would have to face new circumstances. For now, I needed rest. I hugged my pillow and allowed myself to cry one more time, mourning the perfect day that had turned into a nightmare. I wept for the love I thought was unshakable, now shattered in mere hours, and for the future I had dreamed of that now seemed impossibly distant. Yet even as tears fell, I felt something else growing within me. Thinking of the baby, the new life I was creating, I made a solemn promise to myself to be strong for both of us, no matter what lay ahead. The night's stillness enveloped me, but it was different from the suffocating silence that had tormented me at the reception. This was a different kind of quiet, one that whispered of new beginnings. I closed my eyes, finally letting exhaustion take over. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt cruelly at odds with the previous night's chaos. Sunlight streamed through the curtains of my childhood room, illuminating my crumpled wedding dress scattered on the floor, a harsh reminder of yesterday's events. I woke up feeling heavy in both body and soul. For a moment, in my still dreamlike state, I hoped it had all been just a nightmare. But when I felt the sting on my cheek, where Barbara's hand had struck me, reality hit me hard. As I slowly got up, every movement seemed to require superhuman effort. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes were swollen from crying, my hair was tangled, and my face wore an expression of defeat I had never seen before. I whispered to myself that I had cried enough, that I couldn't stay like this forever. Taking a deep breath, I headed to the bathroom to get ready. The cold water I splashed on my face helped fully wake me and clear my thoughts. While brushing my teeth, I began to consider what I needed to do next. I needed a plan, something to hold on to in this chaos. When I went downstairs, I found my parents in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and toast filled the air, creating an atmosphere that felt surreally normal after yesterday's events. My mother came to hug me, asking how I was feeling. I answered honestly that I felt like I had been hit by a truck as I sat down at the kitchen table. My father set aside his newspaper and looked at me with concern. He suggested that my mother and he had been talking about possibly pressing assault charges against Barbara. The suggestion caught me off guard. I told him I didn't want to go that far. My father interrupted with controlled emotion, saying what that woman had done and said to me in front of everyone was unforgivable. I looked to my mother for her opinion. She sat next to me and took my hand, agreeing with my father but adding that the decision was mine to make. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts. The idea of facing Barbara in court and reliving that public humiliation made my stomach churn. Yet part of me wanted justice, wanted her to face the consequences of her actions. I finally opened my eyes and told them I needed time to think about it. My parents nodded, respecting my uncertainty. We began breakfast in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Then the doorbell rang. My father went to answer it, and moments later, I heard a voice that made my heart stop. It was Ryan, pleading with my father to let him talk to me. My father responded with an icy tone, asking how Ryan could even think that was possible. I stood up from the table, my legs slightly shaking. With a composure that surprised even me, I told my father it was okay, that I would talk to him. My father looked at me with concern but nodded and stepped aside. Ryan came into the kitchen looking as exhausted as I felt, with dark circles under his eyes, disheveled hair, and still wearing his wedding suit. He started to apologize, in a trembling voice, but I held up my hand to stop him. I suggested we go to the garden, not wanting to have this conversation here. We went out to my parents' small backyard, where the fresh morning air and scent of flowers helped me maintain my composure. I simply said, "Talk," and crossed my arms over my chest. Ryan ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now just found irritating. He started explaining that he couldn't excuse what happened yesterday, that he had just frozen when he saw his mother and heard her words. I repeated his words about not knowing how to react, feeling anger rise inside me. I reminded him that his mother had humiliated me in front of all our guests, called me a liar and opportunist, and struck me while he just sat there frozen. Through tears, Ryan admitted he was a coward, that he should have stopped his mother and protected me, but he still loved me and our baby, asking for another chance. For a moment, I felt my resolve waver, feeling the urge to fall into his arms and forget everything. But then I remembered his silence, how he just sat there while I was being slapped. I felt something harden inside me. I told him. His actions had spoken louder than any words he could say now. He stepped closer, insisting we could start over, saying he would distance himself from his family if necessary, begging me not to throw everything away over one small mistake. And that was when it happened. In that moment, I felt something I had never experienced before. I felt strength and determination rising from the deepest part of my being. I was no longer the Sophie who tried to please everyone. I was no longer a woman who would settle for scraps of affection. I was a new person, who had decided to fight for my dignity, and my child's dignity. I repeated his words, "One small mistake," with a voice trembling with emotion. I told Ryan that what happened yesterday wasn't a small mistake, but a revelation, showing me who he really was and who I really was. I stepped back, widening the distance between us. I explained how for years I had tried to fit into his world, enduring his mother's contemptuous words and his family's disapproving looks. I told him how I had convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I just became a better person, they would finally accept me. But the previous day had made me realize that I would never be enough for them, and worse, I would never be enough for him. When Ryan tried to interrupt, I held up my hand to stop him. I told him that, when I needed him most, when he should have been by my side, he chose his family over me, and our baby. I said that in that moment, he had lost the right to be part of our lives. I watched the color drain from his face. He begged me not to say such things, swearing we could start over, promising he would do anything. I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. I told him it was too late. I explained that I wasn't alone anymore, that I had to think about our child, and I couldn't raise a baby in an environment where the mother would be despised and the father wouldn't protect them. He asked in a faint voice what I was saying. I told him it was over, that there would be no reconciliation or second chances, that from this moment on, we were nothing more than strangers to each other. Ryan's voice was thick with despair as he protested that it was his child too. I told him he could have visitation rights if he wanted, but we could never be a family. That possibility had vanished the moment he chose silence yesterday. Seeing the tears on his cheeks caused me a moment of pain, but I remained firm. I told him to leave, that I needed time to think about the next steps, and that my lawyer would contact him about arrangements for the baby. Ryan stared at me in disbelief, pleading one last time. I simply said goodbye and turned my back to him. I listened to his footsteps slowly fade away, and when I was sure he was gone, I released the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My parents were standing at the kitchen door, watching me with expressions that mixed pride and concern. My mother came to embrace me, and I let myself fall into her arms, letting my tears flow freely. But these tears were different, not of sadness or despair, but of release and relief. My father joined our embrace, and for a while, we just stood there, an unshakable family unit. He whispered that he was proud of me. I gently pulled away and wiped my tears, thanking them both. My mother assured me they would always be there for me and the baby. I smiled and placed my hand on my stomach. I mentioned all the things I needed to think about: finding a job, a place to live. My father interrupted, telling me to take it one step at a time, to rest now after everything I'd been through, saying there was plenty of time. I nodded, feeling tired but experiencing a strange sense of peace. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, becoming a single mother, facing people's gossip and whispers, rebuilding my life from scratch. But looking at my parents, I felt I could overcome anything. I was no longer an abandoned bride or a victim, but a strong woman determined to forge a destiny for myself and my child. The decisive turn my life had taken in the past 24 hours was terrifying but also exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I felt in control of my own destiny. I no longer needed to try to fit into someone else's mold. I had gained the freedom to be myself and make my own decisions. As I walked back to the kitchen, my mind was already considering the next steps. I would need a lawyer, prenatal checkups, prepare for the birth, and find a job. The list seemed endless, but rather than feeling overwhelmed, I felt energized. This was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one that I would write myself. And while the future was uncertain, some things were clear. I would never again let anyone undervalue me. I would never again stay silent in the face of injustice. And most importantly, I would never again compromise my dignity, or my child's dignity, to please others. The turning point had come, and I was ready to face whatever lay ahead. With my head held high and determination in my heart, I took my first step into my new life.